Hello and welcome. Today we're taking on a subject which might seem like it's a little bit out of the scope of this course, but I don't actually think that it is. And it's the topic of sexual and gender harassment in institutions like universities, laboratories, libraries, other kinds of academic and scientific institutions. One place to jump off on this topic is a major report that was done in 2018 by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. The title of the report is Sexual Harassment of Women, Climate, Culture, and Consequences in Academic Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. This NASEM report is one of the most comprehensive and I would say one of the most informative reports that is currently available on the pervasiveness of sexual and gender harassment in U.S. universities and laboratories. And they make a number of very important points. It's a report that's really worth reading, which is partly one reason why I made the report available to you. But within the report, they include in sexual harassment a wide range of forms of harassment, bullying, and mistreatment. They, of course, include the egregious forms of misconduct that we see in the newspapers. Things like sexual assault, trading favors for sexual cooperation, coercion, and so forth. Those are the kind of most widely known forms of sexual mistreatment and misconduct. But the report also spends a good deal of time on other kinds of sexual harassment which are not so visible and not so well known, which include acts of incivility, derogatory comments, sexual allusions, negative statements about gender, and other flags of negative climate, which are known to be toxic for the individuals to whom they are directed. Here are a couple of empirical studies which are reported in the NASEM report, but both of these studies have to do with faculty and staff misconduct or harassment towards students, and they show dramatically worrisome data. In the graph on the left, gender harassment, including sexist hostility, medical students report 69% report having experienced this kind of misconduct. These are studies done at Penn State University and the University of Texas system. The Penn State survey indicates that 43% of undergraduates, 59% of graduate students, and 73% of medical students have experienced gender harassment, including all forms of harassment, while 5.1% of undergraduates, 6% of grad students, and 5.7% of medical students report having experienced unwanted sexual attention and sexual coercion. Those are the more prominent forms of sexual mistreatment that I mentioned in the previous slide. These are, for me, staggering results, both in terms of the absolute numbers of students who were affected and the negative effects that these experiences can absolutely be understood to have on the ability of the mostly women, sometimes men, who were affected to fulfill their educational potential. The University of Texas study shows a similar pattern, but also allows us to see significant differences across fields of study, which implies differences in culture in some way. Engineering and medicine provide significantly more harmful environments for female students than non-STEM and science disciplines do. A diagram that's included in the report is called the iceberg diagram, and it was originally designed by a faculty member here at the University of Michigan. But the diagram is intended to illustrate the range of kinds of behavior which all fall under the general rubric of sexual and gender harassment. It distinguishes between the publicly familiar forms of sexual coercion and unwanted sexual attention, which are publicized, but it also emphasizes the importance of less visible forms of harassment and mistreatment. And that includes name-calling, offensive body comments, offensive sexual teasing, statements like, what's a girl doing here in the engineering curriculum, That's offensive in two ways: girls, and that females should not be involved in engineering. Both are derogatory statements, and there's really excellent empirical research that shows the harm that comments like that, negative stereotypes like that, have on the individuals to whom they are addressed. But one of the things which I think makes this issue so relevant for our course is the fact that the study emphasizes the role that organization and culture play in creating an environment where harassment is common. I'd like to read this paragraph because I think it's an important one. By far, the greatest predictors of the occurrence of sexual harassment are organizational. Individual level factors, sexist attitudes, beliefs that rationalize or justify harassment that might make someone decide to harass a work colleague, a student, or a peer, are surely important. However, a person that has proclivities for sexual harassment will have those behaviors greatly inhibited when exposed to role models who behave in a professional way as compared with role models who behave in a harassing way, or when in an environment that does not support harassing behaviors and or has strong consequences for those behaviors. Thus, this report considers some of the organizational and environmental variables that increase the risk of sexual harassment perpetration. Now, some people might believe that in a business or an organization, a university, that sexual harassment is primarily a problem of interpersonal behavior. One might say, it might be asserted, that sexual harassment happens when one individual behaves in an unacceptable way towards another individual or towards a group of individuals. And we might say, or that person might say, we just need better rules and better enforcement. But I think we actually have seen reasons in this course to understand that analysis of the problem is at the very least an oversimplification and maybe just a profound misunderstanding of the problem. Rather, the behaviors in question are both the result of the institutions and culture and also the constituents of the institutions and culture. There's a feedback mechanism, in other words, between the current cultural environment in, let's say, a department of physics and the shaping which that departmental culture does on faculty members, staff members at all levels, which then reproduces forms of behavior which inform the culture in the next generation. So to change patterns of sexual harassment in an institution, the report argues, and I want to put it in front of you as a hypothesis, it is necessary to change the culture that many thousands of people in the institution share. I emphasize the many thousands. The University of Michigan, for example, employs something like 35, 40,000 people of faculty and staff, all three campuses. That is a large population to try to bring into a process of culture change. And yet, if sexual and gender harassment is the result of pervasive patterns of self-renewing culture, then pervasive culture change is really a crucial part of our ability to change the environment of sexual harassment. The authors of the study refer to some specific organizational factors which they believe either facilitate harassment or make harassment less likely. One factor is a kind of an obvious one, the extreme gender imbalance that exists in many professional work environments. When a faculty member, a female faculty member in mechanical engineering says, "I'm the only woman who has ever taught in this department," that by itself is an indicator that there's a likelihood that young women students are likely to feel unwelcome and possibly harassed in that environment. If there is a perceived absence of organizational sanctions for harassing behavior, that is, if harassers in even kind of minor ways are allowed to continue their behavior, that then encourages other forms of harassing behavior. They refer also to work environments where sexist views and sexual harassing behavior are modeled, and they also emphasize the importance of power differentials. If a department chair has a basically a gender discriminating worldview. He looks at women in his field in a different way from men in his field. The fact that he has the power of being the department chair really changes the way in which he's able to behave towards women. The authors of this, the NASEM report, make the point that gender harassment is primarily not about sex. They believe, they advocate for this idea. Rather, it is aimed at indicating disrespect towards the target, rather than sexual exploitation. This has an important implication for institutional change, because an institution, this is an important point about the culture change that would make harassment less likely, an institution that creates a strong core set of values emphasizing civility and respect is less conducive to gender harassment. This is a hypothesis, and it's a hypothesis for which there is some organizational empirical research. Quoting from the report, organizational climate is by far the greatest predictor of the occurrence of sexual harassment, and ameliorating it can prevent people from sexually harassing others. A person more likely to engage in harassing behaviors is significantly less likely to do so in an environment that does not support harassing behaviors or has strong, clear, transparent consequences for these behaviors. So there are some important recommendations in the report, and I think all of them are relevant to the kind of to the discussions which we've had of safety culture. This would be sexual harassment safety culture. But first, the first recommendation, really probably the leading recommendation, is the importance of establishing a pervasive expectation of civility and respect in the workplace. Secondly, they recommend a diffusion of the concentrations of power that give potential harassers the opportunity to harass women and sometimes men within their domains. And we've seen at the university several instances in the past year of harassment which occurred because of the power differential that existed. A third recommendation, ensure that the institution honors its values by refusing the star culture, which is common in universities, that makes high prestige university members untouchable. The brilliant astronomer, widely published in the best journals, who was also given to making sexist comments in his laboratory, that tolerant culture is one which allows sexual harassment to proliferate. A fourth recommendation, to be vigilant and transparent about the processes of investigation and adjudication. If potential harassers don't know that there are sanctions, there is a real and effective investigative process, then they will be less concerned about the nature of their own behavior. A fifth recommendation, to create effective processes that assures that complainants do not suffer retaliation. One of the most difficult obstacles for reporting is the fact that people who've been subject of sexual harassment are often concerned that they will suffer from retaliation, maybe public shaming, but maybe career retaliation. Maybe a PhD supervisor who is the perpetrator and who is able to impose a lot of harm on the young PhD student. A sixth, I think it's sixth recommendation, consider the candidate's receptivity to the values of, and this has to do with hiring, it has to do with recruitment, that hiring committees should consider candidates' receptivities to the value of a respectful, civil, and non-harassing environment throughout the hiring and appointment process. And that includes research directors, department and program chairs, and other positions of authority. When considering a department chair, for example, one shouldn't select a department chair simply on the basis of the fact that he or she has a distinguished research record. We should also try to evaluate, is this potential department chair really an advocate for the value of a respectful, civil, non-harassing environment? And then finally, a recommendation, kind of squaring the circle here, to address the gender imbalance that exists in many leadership circles. If there aren't powerful women represented in PhD committees and dean's offices and executive officer positions in a university, then there's a greater likelihood that gender harassment will be taken for granted. So this line of thought in the report emphasizes the importance of culture and power within an organization. They argue that the problem of harassment in an institutional context is a particularly difficult one because it derives from multiple features of the organization. There is the ambient culture of the organization, which is often thought to be a facilitator of harassing behavior, which can happen in a patriarchal culture that is deferential to the status of the high-powered individuals at the expense of lower-powered targets. And I think we can all tell a little story. In fact, CRLT, the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching, one of the most powerful skits that it can perform is to literally perform a department chair and a junior faculty person acting out a kind of patriarchal, sexist interaction. There is the fact that executive leadership in many institutions is predominantly male, and men bring with them often a set of gendered assumptions which they do not recognize. The power relations within an organization are an important part of the environment of harassment. The hierarchical nature of the power relations of academic institutions are conducive to mistreatment of various kinds, conducive in the most direct way. Power relations give an ability to coerce or incentivize or pressure more junior people, less powerful people to do various things, and that can extend to sexual harassment. Bosses to administrative assistants, research directors to postdocs, thesis advisors to PhD candidates. These are all unequal relations of power, and they create a conducive argument for sexual harassment in many varieties. In each of these cases, the superior actor has enormous power and influence over the career prospects and work lives of the women over whom they exercise power. One of the key ideas that comes out of this analysis is the importance of civility, respect, and bullying. There are habits of behavior which individuals bring to the workplace which are very harmful to a normal, positive work environment. Some of those habits have to do with masculine entitlement. Some have to do with disdainful attitudes towards female scholars, female scientists. There is sometimes an underlying willingness to bully others, which finds expression in an academic environment. And in fact, recent research gives a lot of attention to the topic of what they refer to as toxic leadership in the tech sector, and I think it applies also to the academic world, and the, quote, masculinity contest culture that this group of researchers finds to be a root cause of the toxicity that this sector displays for women professionals. That research is done in the tech sector, but in economics, in maybe civil engineering, maybe in philosophy, I think we might well find indicators of the same kind of toxic assumptions about social relationships between men and women. Is it sufficient to consider enhancements of enforcement and policy to aim to reduce the incidence of sexual harassment and misconduct? Institutions often want to imagine that there are easy fixes when a scandal or a pattern of sexual harassment, misconduct has emerged. And often renewed attention is given to, quote, encouraging victims of harassment to come forward with their complaints. Universities, like other workspaces, have mandatory reporting officers who are designated by law, who must make a mandatory report if they are informed of an instance of sexual misconduct. There are offices of institutional equity which can conduct investigations. And yet the reality is harassment, sexual harassment, gender harassment persists in institutions, even well-intentioned institutions like our university. And it does seem that I think we have reason to believe from our study of organizational dysfunctions that institutions that rely primarily on enhanced enforcement and reporting, those institutions have really not understood the problem adequately. Sexual and gender harassment is an institutional problem. It is a problem of institutional culture. So policy enforcement, reporting mechanisms, these are necessary parts of the institution's efforts, but the problem is analogous to a chemical company executive who defines safety in terms of days lost to accidents. The administrators who focus primarily on enforcement are, in my view, focusing on the wrong thing. To change the environment for women facing sexual harassment, or for that matter, for people of color facing racial disparagement, it is necessary most fundamentally to change the expectations of behavior at every level. And in fact, I think we can find lots of examples around the university of academic cultures that valorize, that give value, give prestige to dominance, bullying, habits of intervening in job interviews and academic talks, which really have to be understood as a kind of academic bullying. We see these signs of academic culture that privilege some people and disrespect others. And it is, I think there's good evidence, good research evidence to show that a culture which tolerates academic bullying and incivility is one which is ripe for other kinds of harassment as well, including sexual and gender harassment. Furthermore, an academic culture that exempts senior and accomplished academic stars from normal standards of respectful courtesy is likewise a culture ripe for harassment. So a really interesting and I think pivotal question is how can mid-level administrators, directors, department chairs, graduate directors, lab directors, how can these mid-level administrators be brought to see and internalize the values that the institution espouses of respect and civility? If the university says, we care about respect, civility, and diversity, we care about treating everyone respectfully, if that's the university's value, the institution's value, how can that value be communicated in an effective way to the individuals, men and women, who are in positions of responsibility in mid-level administrative positions? And it is interesting on our campus that the CRLT, the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching, has designed all-day sessions for leaders, including department chairs, other chair-level administrative officers, and deans, to participate in training which allows them to see the importance of this kind of value transformation. Several of the theories which we have studied seem relevant to the question of sexual harassment, sexual and gender harassment in universities. First of all, there is the topic of normalization of deviance, or the normalization of bad behavior in the university workplace. We can kind of see a creeping level of harassing language, which goes from barely detectable to outrageous in a series of small steps. Secondly, the emphasis which we've placed and the experts we've considered have placed on safety culture in technology organizations is really paralleled by this idea that a university needs to embody a broad culture of respect and civility. So what is safety culture for a power plant? The analog is a university culture of respect and civility. There's the problem of loose coupling, which we've seen already, and that has an analog on the side of sexual harassment in organizations like universities, in particular the fact that university presidents and top leaders and provosts are limited in their ability to change behavior at lower levels in the organization. They have limited capacity to change behavior of the deans or the department chairs. There's also the problem of what the boss wants to hear. This seems to be a crucial part of the way that the scandal at MSU developed, that subordinates get the signal that they really are not welcome to bring forward bad news. They're not welcome to bring forward, quote, weak signals about harassment and sexual misconduct. And then there is also the problem of creating real culture change and real behavior change. And I think we've seen that also in our study of safety culture. There are also conflicts of interest that interfere with positive organizational changes concerning sexual harassment. So if, for example, we thought that the current system of doctoral supervision with one supervisor and then a very high level of dependence of the doctoral candidate on the doctoral supervisor, if we were kind of thinking that system needs to be changed so that there's more of a diffusion of authority, well, the individuals who are primary supervisors, for a variety of reasons, some of which are good academic reasons, prefer to have sole primary authority over the doctoral student's work. So there's kind of a conflict of interest between the goal of improving the climate for female PhD students and the claim of academic autonomy, which the supervisors have. Department chairs, another kind of conflict of interest. Department chairs may prefer research productivity on behalf of their faculty over progress on respect and civility. So they may give more attention to the topic of supporting the research productivity of their faculty than to having seminars, workshops, trainings on improving respect and civility in the department. And then there are problems which we saw in the high reliability organization discussion, problems having to do with mental framework. This is generically a failure to perceive certain kinds of behavior as being unacceptable. So once a person is kind of framed, it's fine to bark through the open door to an administrative assistant, get me a cup of coffee. That sounds a little bit harsh, a little bit rude, but once it's been normalized in the mental framework of the boss, this is just normal, and it's hard for him to see that maybe it's a behavior that needs to be addressed. And then more kind of in the same key, but slightly different point, the need for mindfulness, which is put forward in the high reliability organization literature, the need for paying attention to weak signals of failure. Administrators often do not really want to know that toxic conditions exist in the areas of their responsibility, and yet addressing sexual harassment before it becomes a crisis really depends on being very attentive to weak signals and kind of indefinite information which can be addressed before it turns into a crisis. So indeed, sexual and gender harassment, I think, is very relevant to the topic of organizational causes of large accidents, even though there's no meltdown that occurs at MSU or Penn State University or possibly the University of Michigan. There's no meltdown, but there's a lot of human harm if the university is not able to rectify the internal organizational and cultural deficiencies which permit an ongoing culture of sexual harassment.